Why, it's an early morning here, and most welcome to H827. Clement weather today. It's probably getting warm, I'd say, and it looks like it's going to change during the afternoon to rainy. That sort of sky we have today. It's what is that in English? Styrated. I'd like to continue with this marvelous book, The Chain of the Mirror by Rudolf Gachet. One of the reasons is that it has opened up so many doors. I would say it's probably the most eloquent, exact construction of deconstruction. And of course, he was well acquainted with Jacques Derrida, Rudolf Gachet. But that's, of course, is not enough. Many of his other interpreters were very skilled. They were smart enough to catch on to this wave of continental philosophy that Derrida stirred up, and already was something that had a momentum and showed the direction where it was going. But still, let me just start somewhere in the beginning of the book. Just have a look at this page 35, the self-destruction of reflection, chapter 3. And let me just start here. In order to understand what Hegel, in the difference between Fichte's and Schelling's system of philosophy, calls the self-destruction of reflection, it is necessary to study the passage from reflection proper to absolute or speculative reflection. Such an investigation requires us to distinguish clearly among the several types of reflection to which Hegel refers. Indeed, in Hegel, the notion of reflection is not a unified concept. The word appears in a variety of contexts that determines its meaning and its use in at least 3 different ways. Let's start with number 1, absolute reflection as characteristics of the speculative process as a whole must be distinguished from rectified reflection. As outlined in the Logic of Essence section of the Greater Logic. Which is itself a speculative reinterpretation of the reflexive process of understanding. Therefore, we can distinguish between reflection as 1, the dissolving force of understanding, two, the totalizing power of the speculative process, and 3, one moment within that process. each of these different notions of reflection is itself divided into a number of aspects. In outlining the logico-dialectical process of the passage or reflection, from understanding to reason, I shall skip the critical and dialectical reappropriation or reflection in the greater logic, that is from Hegel, and limit my discussion to the major features of the problem by following the distinctions Hegel made in the difference between isolated and philosophical reflection. So we have three different processes of reflection, and well, to be a bit short here, I can say this is where you find the kernel of the poodle. This is the important stuff, and it's this lack of understanding that reflection can be different and sort of grouping them all together into one singular mass. This is where the problem actually lies. So you see the idea of the mirror has different readings. This can be compared to the Necker cube or some other ambigram. That in the mirror we have Necker cube 1, the outside turning, and Necker cube 2, the inside turning. Or whereas in the ambigram of the hare and the duck, we have either the hare or the duck. The mirror lends itself to more perceptions, and we should be careful here not to talk about these perceptions as interpretations in the regular sense, because these are actual perception. The world is differentiated from the beginning. It's not only the subject. I think that is a good understanding. It's not only the subject that sees things differently, from different angles, with different perspective. It's in the process subject and object this differentiation occurs. And almost correct it would also be to say, this have to be almost correct at this point, because it's a pedagogical hint to you, and it is that the general tendency to clump this together, not seeing the differences, that's part of the problem. To see it as one singular identification, and also not understanding the subject's role, the role it's taking. In, for instance, quantum mechanics, that's a good example, is because the world can be perceived, experienced differently, and not, let me really underline this, not interpreted different. And that is very important to sort of not mix together in this instance. We understand it's usually we say the reason for we have different perceptions of the world is that we have different subjects and they all interpret the world differently. And thereby we do not have to include the subject into the worldview, into the whole, into the logos. We can sort of separate the subjective and say, well, it's just a subjective interpretation of the reality. The reality remains self-identical. I think you see more and more why Rodolphe Gasquet's excellent, excellent further reading of Derrida is so incredibly helpful. Let me continue here with the first, and that's the isolated reflection. Isolated reflection, often called simple, pure, or common reflection, is the mode of thought characteristic of the positioning Setzen particular to understanding. And this is also representing the force of limitation, die Kraft des Beschränkens. And understanding only posits opposites, Entgegengesetze. Isolated reflection thus perpetuates the dissolving activity of understanding by fixing those things that understanding posits as being in opposition to each other. In short, isolated reflection is a mode of thought that has no relation to the absolute, that is, to the unity or totality of what the fixed opposites presuppose as their common medium or element. Lacking such a relation, isolated reflection remains incapable of raising itself above itself, or above what it is opposed to. Since it has no relation to the absolute, it remains isolated. Let's continue after the bus. So let's continue here with isolated reflection. In the isolated reflection, the absolute remains isolated as well. The isolated reflection doesn't have connection to the absolute. And then we come to the second one, which is philosophical reflection. Philosophical reflection, according to the difference, is the instrument of philosophizing. Since the task of philosophy is the construction of the absolute or totality for consciousness, philosophical reflection is called upon to mediate between isolated reflection and the divided totality that it produces. Yet, in order to be able to render pure reflection fluid and thus overcome its obdurate oppositions, philosophical reflection must entertain some form of relation to the absolute. How then does this relation to the absolute become manifest in philosophical reflection? And what are the ways in which it surmounts to the dualism of isolated reflection? Here comes the explanation. Whereas simple reflection or reflection without relation to the absolute perpetuates the opposite posited by understanding, philosophical reflection conceives the totality of, or the absolute. It does so, however, in a merely formal manner, because philosophical reflection belongs to the realm of understanding. It can grasp the true and real synthesis of opposites only, this is important, only if it inverts verkehren, German, that synthesis into something opposed to that which it is the synthesis of. According to Hegel, Philosophical reflection inverts reason as the unifying faculty into something merely reasonable, verständiges. Philosophical reflection originates in opposites and the formal insight into the necessity of a unity of opposites terms. It posits this unity in opposition to the initial dualistic structures as their beyond. The dualistic structures are surmounted by philosophical reflection, and dualistic oppositions you have in the isolated reflection. And the interesting thing here is, well, the thing that is most stringent and important is, I think normal day we have an either or attitude to these things, so I think it should be either philosophical reflection or it should be isolated reflection. Come later to speculative or absolute reflection. But these are not, in that sense, excluding each other. And it's this very exclusion that brings about problems. Once you have exclusions, you have limitation. And once you have limitation, you are possibly preferring the isolate to the absolute, or vice versa. You said it should also be the absolute and nothing but the absolute.
Άνοιξε λίγο σε παρακαλώ. Άνοιξε την πόρτα. Όχι, όχι, να το φωνάξω. Поднимайся. Поднимайся.
You can also say that philosophical reflection originates in opposites and the formal insight into the necessity of a unity of opposite terms. So first you have a sort of a movement where you have the isolated reflection. You look into the mirror and it's either the thing you see in the mirror reflection, or it can be the idea of the original, not the reflection, what is looking into the mirror. Then you go further to philosophical reflection, and then you take in the both of them, both what is looking into the mirror and the reflection. Then you have both of them. So you see the difference here. It's some development going from dualism, if you say, going to philosophical reflection, which takes in them both. That's the synthesis. And then we're going to move into the absolute reflection, which is once more different, not similar. So philosophical reflection is the beyond of the isolated reflection. You can also say it encompasses the both. But be careful here not to say that philosophical reflection is complementary. I think one or two of you might want to say that. But that will lead you into the trap of stopping the process somewhere midway. philosophical reflection expounds the true nature of this identity, it sets forth Darstellung as the binding power of irreducible opposites. Consequently, it can conceive of the original synthesis as a union only in the form of an antinomy of absolutely dualistic terms. And because it is indebted to understanding, philosophical reflection continues the separating activity of this mode of thought. It can behold only the analytical form of absolute synthesis, or as Hegel expresses it, the purely formal appearance of the absolute. So that's why I mentioned in the beginning here of the paragraph, it's a formal representation. Indeed, for philosophical reflection, the absolute is at most an antinomy, a synthesis of opposites. And nullification, that's a cumbersome word in English. I prefer the German Vernichtung. That would be in Swedish förstörelse of the opposites in contradiction. So by taking them in together, doing the synthesis, the opposites, the force of the opposites is destroyed in a way. The very force goes away because it's a formalization. The knowledge that flows from philosophical reflection is pure knowledge, and knowledge without true intellectual intuition. Yet the purely formal or antinomic synthesis to which philosophical reflection arises itself is not just any unity. It is a unity thoroughly determined in itself. It is a totality whose antinomic nature is grounded in what Hegel calls reflective determinations, Reflexionsbestimmungen, or in what Kant calls the categories of understanding. These reflective determinations, which arise through abstraction from absolute identity, helps philosophical reflection set forth its antinomic synthesis of opposites. But why do these reflective determinations lead only to purely formal or antinomic union? Well, that is the question to be answered a bit later. I think we're going to have to take another little break here. Så vi fortsätter här. Vi är nu inne på området filosofisk reflektion. We are in the area of philosophical reflection. And what we said is philosophical reflection try to take into consideration the dual aspects of reflection, but it does so in a formal way. And by doing so, it's a nullification of the opposites in contradiction. It's a little bit like you have minus and plus, put them together, you get zero. You have an acid and you add an alkaline, and in the end you get zero. You take water, you add heat, and you get zero because of evaporation. So that is philosophical Vernichtung, nullification. Very troublesome word in English. Yet the purely formal or antinomic synthesis to which philosophical reflection raises itself is not just any unity, it is a unity thoroughly determined in itself. It is a totality whose antinomic nature is grounded in what Hegel calls reflective determination, Reflexionsbestimmung, or in what Kant calls the categories of understanding. These reflective determinations, which arise through abstraction from absolute identity, help philosophical reflection set forth its antinomic synthesis of opposites. But why do these reflective determinations lead only to purely formal and antinomic union? Why is that? Why doesn't philosophical reflection lead to the absolute, so to speak, or the comprehensive comprehensive understanding? Two reasons must here be mentioned. Since the reflected determinations are abstracted by understanding from the absolute identity, they are thought to be irreconcilable. Hegel writes, infinity and finitude, indeterminism or indeterminatedness and determinatedness, etc., are reflective products of the same sort. There is no transition from the infinite to the finite, from the indeterminate to the determinate. The transition as synthesis becomes antinomy. For reflection, yes, there is no transition from the infinite to the finite, from the indeterminate to the determinate. The transition as synthesis becomes antinomy. For reflection, which separates absolutely, cannot allow a synthesis of the finite and the infinite, of the determinate and the indeterminate, to be brought about, and it is a reflection that legislates here. So the reflection is what determines, as being the law. By analyzing the specific sort of contradiction that exists between these reflexive determinations, one can better grasp not only the exclusively formal quality of the unity to which philosophical reflection is capable of raising itself, but also the second reason for which this unity must remain contradictory. And I think this last thing is the most important in the paragraph. This unity must remain contradictory. It will lose its determining power otherwise, and it will also be something that goes into the strain of philosophical reflection. Needs to be upheld the opposites. At the same time, they also need to be encompassed togetherness. All that is posited by understanding, that is, being and everything limited, is determinate, since philosophical reflection aims at foregoing determination. But that determination proceeds through negation, that is, by positing an opposite to what it's giving. Being and everything limited, because they are determinate, must consequently have an indeterminate before and after, according to Hegel, for the determinate must be bounded by an indeterminate. You hear? The determinate must be bounded by an indeterminate. Without something that is not determined. We cannot have the determined. And that is something that is most often in education and academic circle is overlooked. It is the very great importance of the unknown, because without the unknown, with a lack of knowledge, we cannot understand. They are the contradictions to each other, but they are also sine qua non. Without there would be no understanding. And I think modern educational system is completely fixated on the positive side of knowledge. Get the knowledge, fill in the little brackets, make a cross and you know it, and cast away like a scapegoat everything that is unknowingness. That should go away. This is a little bit similar but not identical. Don't make these different aspects identical, please. But it's similar, and that could help. It's similar to casting away falsehood and just linger on with the good. And I think this could be explained in this way. If you have an apple, why not get rid of the pips and the kernels and just eat the apple? Throw the rest away. Then you're left with the good stuff. That's the idea of positive knowledge. Knowledge that is not unknowingness. Something to ponder about. Well, once more, Rodolphe Gachet is brilliant. The pure and incompatible genius, I would say. Arkady Plotnitsky did an extraordinary work looking at quantum physics, quantum mechanics, together with Jacques Derrida, and he took good use of Georges Bataille and his general economics. But Rodolphe Gachet, when it comes to helping with the understanding of what is deconstruction, showing it is working on several levels. That is a magic in itself. No academic circle or institution has any understanding of things working at different levels, and that full understanding only means that you have understanding on each and other level. And having understanding just on the last level, the most advanced level, is not understanding. It's misunderstanding. And that's a very important thing. Knowledge goes in levels. Each level needs to be acquired. It's not to have enough to have the level that surmounts. That's what Rodolphe Gachet is saying. He says philosophical reflection is above, in some sense, of the opposite reflection or the isolated reflection, but we need them both. And it's an incredible danger in the educational system. It would be quite enough to how it's constructed in a really weird way, to have the upper level finished off, and then you have it all which is beneath. And this is you can say it's a criticism of that idea, or rather shows it's coming from a lack of complete understanding. Well, better understanding, higher level of understanding, I think that's the right word. Okay, I say thank you very much. It was a rather tough lecture. All in there, Rodolphe Gachet is without a doubt the most advanced of the interpreters when it comes to Derrida. Almost at the level of the master himself. Merci beaucoup et adieu, messieurs, dames.